And I hope that before I begin, that you take a minute and ask yourself, let me start over. Let me just get that out. Can't get that out of my system.
Truth is, there's a lot of life that doesn't have a solution you can just find online. So how do you know what to do when you don't know what to do?
Have you ever been in a situation where you had no options? Have you ever been stuck in a situation where there's nothing you can do? It's like that moment in Fortnite when it's just you and one other person. And you know that no matter what happens, one of you is going to win and one of you is going to lose. What are you going to do? I have no options but to stay alive and to figure out how to get that person. Like there's an isolating feeling, isn't there, when you and I have no other choices in front of us? As a matter of fact, when you and I are really mad at somebody, we like to make them think. We like to put out there that they have no other choice but the one we've said. Right? We use that against people often. And it's because we want people to feel isolated. Because when we're isolated, we're trapped. And when we're trapped, we get desperate. And I think this is what's interesting is God is never threatened in the moments in our life when we're desperate. In fact, God uses it for good. In this story that we've been looking at with Joesph, his brothers betrayed him. Just because he had dreams, just because he was honest and open and optimistic and a little naive, if I'm honest. But he chose to tell his brothers what he was dreaming about. And his brothers said, "We hate you." And they betray him and they throw him in a pit, leave him for dead. They tell their mom and dad that he's been killed by a wild animal. But in fact, he was sold into slavery and sent to Egypt. And here's what's so fascinating as you're reading in the Joesph story. Instead of that being something that would be the worst thing possible for Joesph, it ends up being a weird turn of events that Joesph actually finds blessing through this circumstance. It says in Genesis 39, verse 2, that the Lord was with Joesph so that he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Now, we're going to keep reading in this story throughout the week. And let me tell you, it doesn't go smoothly or perfectly for Joesph just because he's living in the house of his master. But what's interesting is Joesph could have never predicted that he had options like this. He could have never known that in the midst of his pain and his loss and being trapped and isolated, that God would bring good out of it. And that is what I want you to remember today, is that when you don't know what else to do, God is with you. When you don't know what to do, when you're at a loss and you feel like there's no way out, God is with you. Let me show you a story about Jesus. Jesus was at a moment in his life in the Gospel of Mark where he had no more options. He didn't know what to do, and he had come to the end of his story in his mind. Actually, it says in Mark chapter 14, and I want you to see this because for me, it's so amazing to see Jesus living this out in front of us, just like Joesph did. It says in Mark chapter 14, verse number 35, he just had Last Supper with his disciples. They've gone to a garden to spend the evening praying. This is the night that he's being betrayed. Judas is bringing a mob of people to arrest Jesus. Jesus is in a garden, verse 35. Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if possible, this hour, this moment might pass from him. And it says what he prayed in the text. It says in verse 36, "Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." A gift to you and I is that our own Savior, Jesus, the person we follow and are forming our life after, our own Savior showed us that when we don't know what the options are, talk to God. And when you and I don't know what the options are, remember that God is right there with you. And I want to say something that is not going to sound like comfort at first. God answered this prayer for Jesus. He asked him, "God, would you take this cup away?" God didn't. Jesus eventually was betrayed, he was tried, and he was crucified. But 3 days later, God raised Jesus from the dead. And I want to remind you that when you feel like there's no options, there's nothing to do, when I don't know what to do, God is with you. I remember when I realized that my grandma her time was short. I remember that my grandma was diagnosed with lung cancer, and I remember that moment in my life when we realized that she had about 9 months to a year to live. But in that moment, that felt like, okay, we've got time and maybe we can extend it. And then I remember as that time went on and as winter came and then it was spring, we knew, oh man, like it's coming near the end. And I remember wanting so badly to fix this situation for me, my family. I wanted so badly to tell my grandma it was going to be okay when we knew it wasn't. And I just remember I kind of had to just surrender. I remember just surrendering to the moment as I went to her house. She lived in Wickenburg, Arizona. And I remember just going into her home, and we all kind of assumed she was on her last few hours. And I remember just holding her arm, and I remember feeling her pulse get weaker and weaker until it wasn't there. And I'm going to tell you, that was a sad moment, and it is sad. It's a sad story. But for me, I remember looking at my mom, and I remember looking at my aunt, and I remember thinking, what an honor to be at this moment with my grandma. It was only us in that room. What a privilege, what an honor, what a joy that we got to be with her in her final moments, and that she felt love from us. I'd never really felt someone in a moment like that where their pulse was fading, but it felt holy to me. I felt like God was with us. It was as if the physical world disappeared and we were very aware that there is more to life than what we can see. I want to remind you, when you don't know what to do, God is with you. When you don't have options, when you think there's nothing to do, could you choose to remember God's right there and you can surrender that moment to him. Jesus did it, and Joesph found out it was true, that when everything went bad, God was still with him. And that even though it might take time, and even though you might have to go through painful things, you might have to lose some things. God may not answer the prayer exactly as you want, but when you don't know what to do, God is still with you. God has the last word in our lives. Not pain, not suffering, not death, and not any sense of lack of options. God is always with you.